Before we talk about the moment a wealthy woman watched in disbelief as a man she once mocked bought her mansion, let's go back to where it all started. She had everything: wealth, power, and a lifestyle most people could only dream of. Expensive cars, designer clothes, a grand estate that symbolized her success. She believed money made her untouchable. Then there was him, a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was invisible to her, just another person struggling to survive. When their paths crossed, she didn't see a human being. She saw someone to laugh at. Before we talk about the moment a struggling man shocked the world by buying a mansion from the woman who once humiliated him, let's meet the two people at the heart of this story. Her name was Olivia Hart. A woman born into wealth, she never knew struggle. She lived in a massive estate, drove luxury cars, and spent her days attending exclusive events. To her, money wasn't just power, it was identity. And anyone without it? They were beneath her. She never cared for people who couldn't match her status. If someone didn't wear designer brands or drive an expensive car, they simply didn't exist in her world. Then, there was Daniel, a man who once had a thriving business, a beautiful home, and a promising future. But life is unpredictable. A failed partnership, a series of unfortunate events, and a betrayal from someone he trusted left him with nothing. One day, he was sealing million-dollar deals, and the next, he was struggling to afford a meal. Despite his situation, Daniel never lost his dignity. He wasn't the type to beg or complain. He believed life had its ups and downs, and one day he would rise again. Until then, he kept to himself, surviving one day at a time. And then their worlds collided. Not as equals, but as two people on opposite sides of society. One, wealthy and arrogant. The other, struggling but still hopeful. And in a single moment, Olivia made sure Daniel knew just how little she thought of people like him. Before we talk about the moment Olivia watched Daniel walk into her mansion, not as a guest, but as its new owner, let's talk about the day she made sure he felt small. It was an afternoon like any other. Olivia had just returned from an expensive shopping trip, her hands full of designer bags. As she stepped out of her luxury car, something caught her eye. A man sitting on a bench near her grand entrance. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together. To her, he was an eyesore. She walked closer, frowning. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing here?" Her voice dripped with irritation. Daniel looked up, his expression calm. "Just resting for a moment." She laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Resting? On my property?" She shook her head. "People like you are always looking for handouts. You should get a job instead of sitting around like this." Daniel met her gaze, unfazed. "I had a job, I had a business. Life doesn't always go as planned." Olivia rolled her eyes. "Excuses. That's why people like you stay poor. You make bad choices and then expect the rest of us to feel sorry for you." As if words weren't enough, she reached into her bag, pulled out a few coins, and tossed them onto the ground. "Here, maybe buy yourself a sandwich." People passing by watched, some laughing along with her. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't pick up the money either. He simply stood up, dusted himself off, and walked away. And in that moment, Olivia thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming next. Before we talk about the moment Olivia lost everything, let's talk about the man she underestimated. Daniel wasn't just another homeless man. He had once lived in a world not so different from Olivia's. Years ago, he had built a successful real estate company. He was respected, wealthy, and admired. But success attracts enemies. A business partner he trusted betrayed him, stealing his clients and leaving him with nothing. A series of bad investments followed, draining his finances. Then, as if life hadn't taken enough, a personal tragedy struck. His wife fell ill, and the medical bills piled up. He did everything to save her, but in the end, he lost her. And with that loss, his will to fight faded. Daniel didn't go broke because he was lazy. He didn't end up on the streets because of bad choices. He had been knocked down by life, harder than most could imagine. But what Olivia didn't know was that he wasn't done. He still had something more valuable than money: knowledge, experience, and connections. One evening, while sitting on a park bench, Daniel heard a familiar voice. It was an old friend, someone who had believed in him back when he was at the top. They talked, and for the first time in years, Daniel saw an opportunity. His friend was involved in a massive real estate deal and needed someone with Daniel's expertise. He offered Daniel a position, a chance to rebuild. Daniel didn't hesitate. He seized the moment, working day and night. Within days, he was back in the game. Within weeks, he had closed a major deal. And within months, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The world had tried to bury him, but he had risen again. And just in time, because Olivia's world was about to fall apart. Before we talk about the moment Olivia stood helplessly at her own mansion's auction, let's talk about how she lost it all. Olivia had always believed that wealth made her untouchable. She never worried about the future. Money flowed in effortlessly, or so she thought. But wealth built on arrogance and reckless spending never lasts. It started with a bad investment. An exclusive fashion brand she put millions into suddenly collapsed due to scandals. She lost a fortune overnight. Then came the legal troubles. She had unknowingly partnered with someone involved in fraud. Lawsuits followed. She thought she could recover, but things only got worse. The stock market crashed, and her company suffered major losses. Debt piled up. Bills she once ignored became impossible to pay. Then came the final blow. The bank called. Her mansion was at risk. She had taken out massive loans to fund her extravagant lifestyle, never thinking she would struggle to pay them back. Now, she had no choice. She had to sell her home to cover her debts. She tried to resist. She looked for investors, reached out to old friends, even begged her financial advisors to find a way. But it was too late. Her once loyal connections distanced themselves. She wasn't the wealthy, powerful Olivia anymore. She was just another person drowning in debt. And so the mansion that had been a symbol of her success went up for auction. But Olivia never could have imagined who would walk through those doors that day. Before we talk about the moment Olivia realized who had just bought her mansion, let's talk about the auction itself. The grand estate that had once belonged to Olivia was now just another asset on sale. The once lavish mansion, filled with designer furniture and priceless artwork, was up for grabs to the highest bidder. She stood there, watching helplessly. The very walls that once made her feel powerful now felt cold and empty. She had spent years hosting elite parties, turning away those she deemed unworthy. Now, she was the one being pushed aside. Buyers filled the room, all eager to claim the mansion at a fraction of its original price. The bidding started and numbers were thrown around quickly. Then, a new bidder entered the room. A mystery buyer. Someone silent, confident, and unshaken. The bids climbed, but each time, the mystery buyer raised the stakes. No one could match him. Olivia watched in horror as the auctioneer slammed the final gavel. The mansion was sold. And then, the moment that would haunt her forever. The buyer stepped forward. It was Daniel. For a moment, the room fell silent. Olivia felt her heart drop. The same man she had mocked, insulted, and tossed aside like he was nothing now owned her home. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even process what had just happened. But Daniel? He just stood there, calm, composed. The tables had turned, and Olivia finally understood what it felt like to be on the losing side. Before we talk about the lesson Olivia learned that day, let's talk about the moment she begged for a second chance. She rushed toward Daniel, desperate. "Listen, we can work something out," she stammered. "I just need time to fix things." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Time?" he repeated. "Like the time you gave me when I was sitting outside this mansion." Her face turned pale. She remembered the words she had spoken to him, the way she had mocked him in front of others. I didn't mean it like that," she whispered. I was having a bad day." Daniel could have humiliated her. He could have thrown her out onto the streets just as she had done to him. But he didn't. He had already won. Instead, he handed her an envelope. Confused, she opened it. Inside was a check, enough for her to start over. Why? She asked, tears in her eyes. Daniel smiled. Because real wealth isn't about money. It's about character. Olivia stood there, speechless, and for the first time in her life, she understood. Before we end this story, let's talk about the lesson. Olivia had once laughed at Daniel, believing he was beneath her. But life is unpredictable. In just a short time, everything changed. She lost everything, and he gained it all. The moral of the story? Never look down on others. Life can change in an instant. The people you ignore today might be the ones in power tomorrow. Money comes and goes, but kindness, respect, and humility last forever. Because in the end, it's not about how much you have, it's about how you treat others.